They told Alita that death would be kinder than marrying Vargas. Now, as the ropes dug into her wrists and his rancid breath fanned her cheek, she believed them. The teepee walls closed in, the air thick with the stench of sweat and smoke, each beat of the drum outside a cruel reminder that her life was no longer her own. Vargas leaned in close, his dark eyes gleaming with possessive hunger. "You're mine now," he said, his grip tightening on her chin, forcing her to look at him. Alita clenched her jaw, refusing to cry, refusing to let him see her break. Outside, the night roared with drunken laughter, the sound of men celebrating her captivity as if it were some grand victory. Vargas traced a finger down her cheek, and Alita's stomach churned. "Forget that Apache blood in your veins," he sneered, voice low and venomous. "You're my wife now." The word stabbed through her like a knife, each syllable a shackle around her neck. Then the teepee flap snapped open, and a shadow filled the doorway. A man stood there, his presence a silent storm, eyes dark and unyielding, his jaw set with a resolve that made Alita's heart ache. Alita's heart surged, a flicker of hope, her breath catching in her throat as she silently begged for help. But Vargas laughed, his arms sliding around her shoulders as if to mark his claim. "Meet my new bride," he said, voice dripping with malice. The stranger's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. Their eyes met, and for one brief, electrifying moment, Alita thought he might save her. But then he turned and walked away, the flap falling shut behind him. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the slow, deliberate breaths of Vargas as he leaned down, his lips brushing against Alita's ear. "I will break you," he whispered, each word a knife twisting deeper into her soul. And as the night stretched on, Alita closed her eyes and tried to remember the feel of freedom. The wind, the open plains, the sound of her father's voice, before it all faded into the darkness. A single tear slid down her cheek, vanishing into the dirt floor beneath her, as Vargas began to hum a haunting, low melody that made Alita's skin crawl. The nightmare was just beginning. Morning broke over the camp like a silent accusation, the pale light spilling through the teepee flap and falling across Alita's bruised face. She lay motionless, her wrists still bound, her body aching from the night before. Vargas snored beside her, his arm heavy and possessive over her waist, his breath reeking of stale liquor. Alita's eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she saw was the ash smudge on the ceiling, the mark left by countless fires that had burned before. Fires that had witnessed the suffering of other girls like her. She swallowed back the bile rising in her throat, her gaze shifting to the teepee entrance. Outside, men shuffled about, voices low, the sound of horses nickering and pots clanging. The stranger from last night passed by, his jaw tight, eyes hard as flint. Alita's heart hammered in her chest, her fingers twitching with the urge to cry out for help. But the memory of Vargas's threat kept her silent. "If you scream," he'd said, his hand wrapped around her throat, "I'll bury you where no one will ever find you." The stranger paused, his gaze flicking towards the teepee. Alita's breath caught, hope flaring like a dying ember. But then he turned away, his shoulders rigid as he walked toward the horses. Vargas stirred, grumbling under his breath as he sat up, his hair matted and eyes bloodshot. "Get up," he said, kicking at her leg. "We leave at sundown." Alita forced herself to sit, biting her lip to keep from crying out as pain shot through her ribs. Vargas grabbed her by the hair, yanking her to her feet. "You belong to me now," he sneered, his fingers tightening, his breath hot against her cheek. "And there's nowhere to run." Outside, the stranger mounted his horse, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw clenched as if he could feel the darkness radiating from the teepee. And as Vargas dragged Alita outside, the sun blinding her, she locked eyes with the stranger one last time, silently screaming for help. The camp buzzed with the chaos of preparation, men shouting orders, women packing supplies, children running underfoot. Vargas dragged Alita by the wrist, his grip bruising, his foul breath hot against her neck as he leaned close. "You're going to act like the good little wife now," he said, his voice low and venomous. Alita clenched her jaw, her gaze fixed on the ground, every muscle tense, fighting the urge to claw his eyes out. She knew it would only make things worse. The stranger from the night before stood by his horse, his gaze dark and unwavering as he watched Vargas haul her past. His jaw was set, his fists clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. Alita's eyes met his, and for a brief, electrifying moment she felt seen, truly seen. But then Vargas yanked her forward, snapping her attention back to his cruel, leering face. "Keep your eyes down, girl," he spat, shoving her toward the back of a wagon. "You're mine now, and don't you forget it." Alita stumbled, catching herself against the wagon's wooden side, her wrists still bound, the rope biting into her skin. The stranger's gaze lingered on her, his dark eyes smoldering with something she couldn't quite name. Anger? Pity? Resolve? Vargas mounted his horse, barking orders at the other men as the convoy began to move. The wheels creaked, horses snorted, and dust rose in choking clouds. Alita climbed into the wagon, her knees trembling as she settled beside an old woman with hollow eyes and a face etched in sorrow. "First time?" the woman asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. Alita nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The woman glanced towards the stranger, who rode near the rear of the convoy, his eyes fixed on Vargas. "That's Kai," she said. "Apache warrior. They say he's got a heart of stone, but if anyone can save you, it's him." Alita's heart stuttered, her gaze shifting to Kai as he rode, his eyes dark as the gathering storm clouds above. And in that moment, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Alita dared to hope that her nightmare might not last forever. The convoy wound through the canyon, dust rising in thick clouds that clung to Alita's skin like a second layer. Vargas rode ahead, barking orders, his voice echoing off the rocky walls. Alita sat in the back of the wagon, her wrists still bound, her muscles aching from hours of jostling against the hard wooden planks. The old woman beside her had fallen asleep, her head resting against a sack of grain, her breaths shallow and labored. Alita's gaze drifted to Kai, who rode several yards behind, his eyes fixed on Vargas with a stare as sharp as a freshly honed blade. Kai's jaw was clenched, his hands gripping the reins so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Alita's heart pounded, each beat a question. Would he act? Would he help her? Would he just keep riding, eyes forward, while she was dragged into a life of suffering? The wagon hit a bump, and Alita winced as her bound wrists smacked against the side, the rope scraping her already raw skin. The old woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and she glanced at Alita with a look of weary resignation. "You can cry, you know," she said, her voice a rasp. "Might make it easier." Alita shook her head, her jaw tight. "I won't give him the satisfaction." The woman's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You're brave," she said. "But brave don't last long out here." Alita swallowed hard, her eyes burning as she turned to look at Kai again. He was staring at her now, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes intense as a stormy sky. Their gazes locked, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. The canyon, the wagon, Vargas's cruel laughter echoing ahead. It was just Alita and Kai, two people caught in a storm of fate, bound by chains of circumstance. And as the wagon creaked forward, Alita lifted her chin, her jaw set in defiance, and whispered to herself, "I will not break." Night fell like a shroud, the camp illuminated only by the flickering light of the central fire. Alita sat alone near the wagon, her wrists unbound but throbbing with pain, the raw skin a constant reminder of Vargas's cruelty. The old woman slept beside her, curled into herself like a child, her breathing shallow and uneven. Vargas was off with the other men, laughing and drinking, their shadows dancing like demons against the canyon walls. Alita's eyes darted through the camp, searching for Kai. He was there, leaning against a tree, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his gaze fixed on the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, turning them to molten amber, and for a moment, Alita forgot to breathe. She should have looked away, but she couldn't. Not when he was the only person who seemed to see her. Not as Vargas's property, but as a woman trapped in a nightmare. Kai's gaze met hers, and Alita's pulse quickened. He straightened, pushing off the tree and walking toward her, each step deliberate, each stride carrying the weight of unspoken words. He knelt beside her, his face so close she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and rough, like gravel sliding down a cliffside. Alita swallowed, her throat tight. "Not yet," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the ground. "But he will." Kai's jaw clenched, his hands fisting at his sides. "You don't belong to him," he said, his voice hard as stone. "I know," Alita said, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to shed. "But what can I do? There's no way out." Kai leaned closer, his gaze fierce, his dark eyes blazing. "There is always a way out," he said, his hand brushing hers, a barely there touch that sent a shiver down her spine. "If you're willing to fight." Footsteps crunched nearby, and Kai pulled back, his expression hardening as Vargas staggered into view, eyes bloodshot, grin vicious. "There you are," he said, grabbing Alita by the arm, his grip bruising. "Time to come to bed, wife." Kai's eyes flashed, but he said nothing, his jaw clenched so tight it looked as if it might crack. And as Vargas dragged her away, Alita glanced over her shoulder, locking eyes with Kai one last time, silently begging him not to forget her. The dawn sky bled crimson as the convoy prepared to move. Vargas barked orders, his voice cutting through the camp like a whip, his eyes bloodshot and wild from a night of drinking. Alita stood beside the wagon, her wrists freshly bound, the rough rope digging into her raw skin. Her body ached, bruises blossoming beneath her torn dress. But it was her spirit that throbbed the most, the ache of feeling Kai's eyes on her and knowing he hadn't intervened. He stood with the other men, his jaw set, his dark eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. Alita's gaze locked onto him, searching for the warrior she had glimpsed the night before, the man who had whispered that she could fight. But now he was just another face in the crowd, silent, unmoving. Vargas grabbed her by the arm, dragging her toward his horse. "You'll ride with me today?" he sneered, his fingers bruising her flesh. "Gotta keep my wife close." Alita bit down on her tongue, refusing to cry out, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing her pain. Vargas swung onto the saddle, hauling her up in front of him, his arm wrapping around her waist like a steel band. Alita's eyes burned as the camp fell away behind them, the sound of horses' hooves echoing through the canyon like the pounding of a war drum. The world blurred around her, but one thing remained sharp. The sight of Kai, riding just behind them, his gaze fixed on Vargas, his fists clenched around the reins. As they rode, the ground grew rockier, the path winding into a narrow ravine. Alita's heart thundered, her skin prickling with a sense of impending danger. Vargas shifted in the saddle, his breath hot against her ear. You think anyone's coming to save you? He whispered, his teeth scraping her cheek. Not even that Apache dog will cross me. Alita's pulse quickened, her gaze darting to the rocky ledge above. Kai was no longer behind them. Panic gripped her, her breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. And then, a shadow moved above them. A flash of dark hair, a glint of steel. Alita's heart leaped, her nails digging into her palms. Kai was watching, waiting. And this time, he wasn't going to stay silent. The canyon walls loomed high, casting jagged shadows that clawed across the path. Vargas kept his arm locked around Alita's waist, his grip like a vice as they rode through the narrow ravine. The other men followed close behind, their laughter echoing off the rocks like a chorus of wolves. Alita's heart hammered against her ribs, her gaze darting to the cliffs above. Kai was up there somewhere. She could feel it, the air charged with a tension that coiled tighter with each step of the horse's hooves. Vargas leaned close, his breath hot and rancid against her ear. You thought that Apache would save you? He sneered, his grip tightening. He's as useless as you. Alita gritted her teeth, swallowing the bile that rose in her throat. The ground beneath them trembled, and Vargas's horse skittered, ears pinning back. The other men exchanged uneasy glances, their hands straying to the weapons at their hips. What was that? One of them muttered, eyes scanning the cliffs. Alita's pulse quickened. Kai was here. He had to be. Above them, a figure moved, a shadow against the rising sun, and then, in a blur of motion, Kai leaped from the ledge, his body a dark, powerful arc slicing through the air. He landed hard, sending a cloud of dust and stones billowing around him, his knife flashing like a shard of lightning. Vargas shouted, jerking the reins as his horse reared, but Kai was already on him, a feral snarl ripping from his throat as he yanked Vargas from the saddle. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs, fists flying, teeth bared. Alita tumbled from the horse, landing hard, the wind knocked from her lungs. The other men rushed forward, drawing knives and clubs, their faces twisted with rage. Kai rolled to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his brow, his knife held steady in his hand. You want to fight? He growled, his voice dark and deadly. Come and get it. Alita scrambled back, her heart a wild drumbeat in her chest as Vargas lunged, his knife flashing toward Kai's throat. Kai ducked, spinning low, and drove his fist into Vargas's gut. The man doubled over, gasping, and Kai grabbed Alita's arm, yanking her to her feet. Run, he said, eyes blazing with fierce resolve. Run now. Alita's legs pumped beneath her, each step a desperate plea for freedom as she sprinted through the canyon, the echoes of Vargas's shouts ringing behind her. Kai's grip on her wrist was firm, his pace relentless as he pulled her through the labyrinth of rocks and brush. The air was thick with dust and the scent of blood, every breath burning Alita's lungs as she fought to keep up. Behind them, Vargas and his men thundered like a pack of rabid wolves, their boots pounding the earth, their weapons glinting beneath the blazing sun. There! Vargas's voice boomed, rage twisting every word. Don't let them get away! Alita's heart slammed against her ribs, her vision swimming as Kai pulled her behind a cluster of boulders. He pressed her back against the stone, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on his brow. Stay quiet, he whispered, his eyes darting to the path they'd just fled. Alita swallowed hard, her entire body trembling as the shouts grew louder, closer. The sound of footsteps echoed through the canyon, a haunting, rhythmic beat that made her blood run cold. They can't be far, one of the men snarled, his voice carrying over the wind. Alita held her breath, her nails digging into the stone behind her, her gaze locked on Kai. His jaw was set, his muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. The men passed by, their eyes scanning the rocks, weapons drawn. One of them paused, his gaze narrowing as he squinted in their direction. Alita's pulse spiked, her lungs screaming for air, but then Kai's hand slid over hers, his grip strong and steady, grounding her in the chaos. "Keep your eyes on me," he whispered, his voice a low, calming rumble. "We're going to get through this." Alita nodded, her throat tight, her heart caught between fear and something far deeper, a sense of safety, a flicker of hope. The men moved on, their shouts fading into the distance. Kai released a slow, measured breath, his eyes still locked onto hers. "We need to keep moving," he said, his hand slipping from hers, but not before she felt the warmth of his touch linger. "Stay close. Stay quiet." And as they crept through the canyon, the sun dipping lower in the sky, Alita dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, freedom was within reach. The canyon narrowed, the walls closing in like the jaws of a beast as Alita and Kai crept through the shadows. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and desperation, the silence fractured only by the distant shouts of Vargas's men echoing off the stone. Alita's heart hammered against her ribs, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she followed Kai's lead, his broad shoulders tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. "They're getting closer," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Kai's jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the rocky terrain. "I know," he said, his voice low and grim, "but we're not out of options yet." Ahead, the path split into two forks, one leading deeper into the canyon, the other sloping upward toward a ridge. Kai's gaze flicked to the ridge, a calculating gleam in his dark eyes. "Climb," he said, grabbing Alita's arm and steering her towards the incline. Alita's legs burned with each step, her palms scraping against the jagged rocks as she scrambled upward. Behind them, the shouts grew louder, angrier. "They went this way," Vargas bellowed, his voice raw with rage. "Find them!" Alita's pulse raced, her vision blurring as she pushed herself harder, every inch of her body screaming for rest. Kai was ahead of her, his hand outstretched, fingers beckoning. "Almost there," he said, his eyes blazing. Alita reached for him, her fingers brushing against his, when a gunshot echoed through the canyon. The sound cracked like thunder, the bullet whizzing past her ear and ricocheting off the rock. Alita screamed, her hand slipping, her body lurching backward. Kai lunged, his fingers locking around her wrist, his grip iron strong. "Hold on," he growled, his muscles straining as he hauled her up. Another shot rang out, sending shards of rock flying. Alita's heart pounded in her throat, her eyes locking onto Kai's, the world narrowing to just the two of them, their breaths mingling, his grip unyielding. "You're not going to die here," Kai said, his voice fierce, his gaze burning with a promise. "Not today." And with one final heave, he pulled her over the ledge, their bodies collapsing onto the ridge as Vargas's men thundered below, their shouts a vicious storm in the darkening canyon. The ridge loomed high above the canyon, the wind howling like a beast as Kai and Alita crouched behind a boulder, their breaths heavy, hearts pounding in unison. Below them, Vargas and his men spread out, their torches flickering like fireflies in the encroaching darkness. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified. The crunch of boots on gravel, the metallic clink of knives unsheathed. Alita's body trembled, her knees scraped raw, her wrists aching from the ropes that had bound her. Kai's jaw was clenched, his gaze fixed on Vargas, who prowled through the canyon floor like a wolf on the scent of blood. "I know you're up there," Vargas shouted, his voice echoing through the canyon walls. "Come down, Apache dog, or I'll burn you both alive." Alita's throat tightened, fear coiling through her like a snake. Kai's hand found hers, his grip warm and strong, grounding her in the chaos. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "When I move, you stay here. Do not come down. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see." Alita shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You can't." "I can," Kai cut in, his gaze fierce, his jaw set. "And I will." Without another word, he rose from behind the boulder, his knife glinting in the fading light. Alita's heart seized as he strode to the edge of the ridge, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkening sky. "Vargas!" Kai's voice boomed, echoing through the canyon like a war cry. Vargas's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Kai standing tall, defiant. "You want me?" Kai called out, his voice steady, unyielding. "Come and get me." Vargas's lips twisted into a sneer, and with a guttural roar he charged forward, his men rushing behind him like a tidal wave of fury. Kai leaped from the ridge, landing hard, his knife flashing, fists swinging. Alita's breath caught, her hands fisting in her lap as chaos erupted below, men shouting, fists flying, the clang of metal on metal. And then a single gunshot cracked through the air, the sound so loud it seemed to shake the earth itself. Alita's scream ripped through the night as she scrambled to her feet, the taste of blood on her tongue, her heart shattering as the world around her fell to pieces.